All right. My name is Stephen Mark Hayden. I am a practicing physician. However, what I have to say to you today is scientific, and I want to appeal to your ability to process science, to listen and judge things for yourself. What I say today is not recommended or approved by the American Medical Association, nor is it approved by the CDC or other certain medical bodies. However, it should appeal to your ability to understand the world around you. What we saw today is October 25th. Just last Thursday night, we witnessed a debate which was very interesting. One of the biggest issues that came up in that debate was between President Trump and former Vice President Biden was COVID. And of course, we've all been following the election, and that is big churning and all supposed to be a big deal, right? But what we've noticed is that the coronavirus is very much a political issue at this point. Initially, we had some lockdowns in the United States. There was a tremendous amount of fear. And right now, a lot of places are experiencing, quote, a second wave, end quote. Let's look at the kind of status, and let's not jump, and let's not be afraid or terrified. Let's try to reason through things. Let's have a little, try to apply a little common sense with a little unusual bit of data analysis. Anyway, let's try to be smarter than the other people. Let's use our heads. Let's not act out of fear. Okay, let's just look in general. Okay, one of the websites I like is the worldometers.info. Worldometers.info. Great website, covers the different countries. If we go to it, what we really see is that worldwide the number of cases is very much going up. Let's see if we can get a good graph. Daily new cases. Bam. Almost hitting 500,000 a day in daily new cases. Remember when just 500,000 total cases was considered a lot? Now we're almost hitting 500,000 cases. Now, is that the true number of cases? No. It's really defined, how do you find a case? Those are cases that actually had lab results that were positive, that were reported to a public health authority. The real number of cases that was actually occurring is probably several times higher than that, maybe half a dozen times higher than that. Let's just say a lot of people get SARS and they don't have time to go see and get tested. And in a lot of countries, it's not going to be paid for. So they won't go get tested. And they'll eventually get over it and they'll spread it to somebody else. Well, if they didn't get tested at the health department, the government will never know about it and it'll never add to these daily cases. So really the daily cases might be anywhere from 500,000, just take a guess, maybe 5, 10 asymptomatic cases for every one. So maybe there's 1 million to 5 million cases a day. Here's what the importance of that. There is a lot of coronavirus out there. So far, China has a very tight control of their population. They monitor everybody through digital payments. They watch all their people with cameras, and there's some pros and cons to that. I'm not here to run them down or be negative about them. But in general, the free world, the Western world, where capitalism is, has not been very effective at controlling the spread of that virus. And, we're not China. That's in the United States. We are not China. So what can you really get out of this graph? That it's going. And it's going to continue in large parts of the world. And there will be tens, hundreds of millions of cases through this winter. That's my forecast is there will be hundreds of millions of cases, maybe 500 million or more cases within the next 6 weeks to 3 months. Now, is that anything to panic over? No. And let me show you why. It's not about just new cases. It's about death rate. So even though we see this graph going way, 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 way up, we actually see this daily death rate actually starting to trend down. Wow, that's weird. Kind of strange. Why is death rates, the total number of deaths, going down when the number of cases is going up? There's several explanations, and probably several factors that contribute to it. When the coronavirus first got out into the neighborhoods, into the country, into the, quote, free world, it got into some elderly institutionalized places. And those places that had nursing homes, once they got infected, they went throughout that nursing home, and there was a large number of fatalities there. What would be interesting is to know how many nursing homes had at least some exposure. That would be very fascinating. We don't know, but I'm guessing anywhere 50, 75, 80% of all nursing homes. I don't know for sure, but it's a substantial, large portion, maybe greater than the average, maybe more than half of them already exposed to some degree. I don't know exactly. What is an exposure? Well, we know that you can go to the doctor and you can get a PCR out of your mouth, or you can get a PCR out of your nose, or you can get a rapid antigen test for the SARS spike protein. What does that mean? Okay, and from a layman's term. What it means is if that virus is in your mouth at the time in which it's swabbed, you can do a highly sensitive test to pick it up. That's it. That's nice. Here's the limitations on that test. You could have SARS growing deep in your lung in the early stage, and you still won't pick it up yet in the mouth. So some people, when they get tested, are initially negative, but a few days later, if they were tested, they would be positive. Some of those people are going to be asymptomatic, and they're never going to be tested. So some people actually exhale it, and they don't ever even know they had it. That's right. Those are the asymptomatic groups. So we don't know how large that asymptomatic group is. Now, there's different types of exposure. And the one thing I want to think, when you think of my presentations, I present things as two different issues. One is the issue of digestive COVID, eating COVID and inoculating your intestines. And the other is inhaling COVID and it going down into the lungs. In simple layman's terms, almost all your serious disease that causes very great sickness is from inhaling the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Have you ever heard of anybody dying from eating SARS-CoV-2? I haven't. Maybe it exists out there. There are symptoms of SARS-CoV-2 when it reaches your intestinal tract, your stomach, your intestines. And some of those symptoms are diarrhea, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 episodes. Sometimes people have 3 or 4 episodes for several days. But you don't die, or usually it's very rare to even require hospitalization from a little diarrhea or a little nausea and vomiting. That's called viral gastroenteritis. Is viral gastroenteritis dangerous? You know, not really. In all my years of treating viral gastroenteritis, I don't think I ever saw anybody die from it. Not one. Now, I've studied SARS-CoV-2 a long time, many papers. Have I ever heard of so-and-so died from an intestinal infection of SARS-CoV-2? Nope. So, let's get a generalized conclusion on that. In general, intestinal SARS-CoV-2 does not kill you. I think that should be fairly well accepted and fairly obvious. Now let's look at the other On the other hand, let's look at pulmonary or alveolar, which is the air sac disease with SARS-CoV-2. Air sac COVID, or when it gets in your lungs from inhaling it, is very dangerous. You can wind up hospitalized. You can wind up being pronounced dead, and it'll be listed as one of your causes of death, along with a bunch of other things, often. But 6% of the people who did die had SARS-CoV-2 listed as the only isolated fatality. Other people had other comorbidities. So, what does that mean? It means that getting it into your lungs is bad and dangerous. Getting it into your intestines, not so dangerous. But is there any advantage to getting it to your intestines? Well, I would say there is an advantage to getting it to your intestines. And here's why. When I take Pepcid, Pepcid lowers my stomach acid. And my stomach acid is there to reduce my viruses that reaches my small intestine. So when I'm taking Pepcid, I should be having more virus particles actually reach my small intestine. And these people that are having more SARS virus reach their small intestine actually seem to be doing better in a lot of studies. So, is that really surprising? You know, I've studied these issues, and I'm sort of the persuasion that your intestinal tract is what really helps develop your immunity. Now, we know that our intestinal tract manage and control a lot of bacteria, and they have to manage a lot of viruses. And so in our communities, people are actually eating SARS-CoV-2. I know I've had some other videos out, and you probably thought some of the stuff I did was just crazy and incredibly dangerous. However, relax, think. Have you eaten food from a restaurant, takeout, or prepared by somebody else? If the answer is yes, then you may have accidentally eaten food that had the virus exhaled on it. Now, what is the characteristic of SARS-CoV-2 virus? It's heavier than air. So if I was speaking while, let's say I'm in a restaurant and I'm a restaurant worker, and I'm making a salad, and I'm talking or singing to myself, and I'm making noise, and the virus is right there in my chest, then I would be breathing out that virus onto the food, and then I'll be sending it out into the community. Now, have I ever heard of anybody who died from eating food that had virus breathed on it? You know, I haven't. Maybe you have. I've studied a lot. I hadn't found it. Now, have I heard of people who got sick or had death associated with inhaling SARS-CoV-2? Yes. And I don't dispute that inhaling the virus is extremely dangerous. But eating it, whether by intention or by accident, may not be dangerous at all. And in fact, eating it accidentally may explain why so many people are starting to have less severe symptoms. That's interesting, isn't it? So, it could be that when we eat the virus accidentally on food prepared by others, guess what? You don't have as serious a disease because you actually develop a little mild immunity because it reaches your small intestine. Now that's a fascinating concept, isn't it? Let's see if we can look at the data and see if that would make sense. All right. Now, if we look at Sweden, let's look at Sweden, a country that let it just rip through their country. Well, they encouraged face masks, and they didn't do any severe lockdowns, but they had a more moderate approach. Let's see how they did. Let's go to this website, and let's go down here to Sweden, which is number 40 on our countries. There's Sweden. Okay. Now you'll hear a lot about Sweden because Sweden did not do real severe lockdown. But look, they had this huge spike in cases right up to around the June 14th. See how that curve goes up, and the more up curve, that means the faster that's accelerating. Then things start slowing down, curving out in June and July. It's still going up. There's still new cases being reported to the health department and to the government in Sweden. This is Sweden. But let's look at Sweden. Let's look at the daily new cases. Look at how these daily new cases, they went to 1,800, almost 1,900 cases. Well, actually 1,600. How many is that? Let's see. What was their peak number of daily cases? On June 24th, there were almost 1,698 cases. Pretty interesting. Look at here recently. Ooh, there's 1,575 over on this day, and let me see, what day was that? That's October 21st. So this peak is starting to look like this peak. So if the people that were getting infected had the same vulnerability to it, we would expect there'd be a huge spike in deaths, wouldn't we? Is that what happens? Let's wait and see. Look at the deaths. The death rate is becoming flat. There's very, very few increasing. Now let's go down to this other one. Look at these death rates. Here's the original spike, the first wave of deaths. So the first wave in Sweden had a huge spike in deaths. Deaths went up over 100 a day. But look, let's look in these last few days here. The second wave started in mid-September, but we got 7 deaths there. How many deaths we got there? 1. How many deaths we got there? 1. We got 0 there. Okay. 1, 3. So far, we're averaging about 2 or 3 deaths a day in Sweden, even though you're having well over 1,000, 1,500 cases a day. And that's the case that you know about. The real cases in Sweden, probably 4 or 5 for every one you know about. So that means there may be 6,000 new people exposed in Sweden with only 7,000 deaths. So the average death rate is getting really low in the second wave. Doesn't that sound like good news? Yay! Yay! Guess what? There is a second wave, but the rate of death is not going up. So a lot of people are getting sick. A lot of people are getting positive tests. A lot of people are going to the hospital. But guess what? Once you've had your first wave and everybody has had a little exposure, well, what do I mean, a little exposure? If they breathed it, they might have gotten real sick. Well, maybe they got some in their food and it was just too low to measure. Maybe they got some in their eyes or on their mouth. Maybe it just didn't reach the deep alveolus. So what they did was their body moved it up. They swallowed it automatically, and some of it got to their intestines, whatever, their immune system processed it, and they have partial immunity. Think of immunity as not you're immune, not immune. How about if you have some exposure to SARS-CoV-2 to your intestines, let's just say you're much less likely to have a severe reaction when you do get more exposure to your lungs. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Guess what? We underestimate how complex your immune system is. Your immune system a lot of times you've had infections in your small bowel and you didn't even know about it, as long as it wasn't accompanied by nausea or vomiting and severe symptoms. Your body is handling all these pathogens, all these bacteria, and it's modulating, it's regulating, it's using your antibodies to control the bacteria in your system. And we're all familiar with the idea of probiotics, good bacteria. Well, our bodies are regulating these things. And so now, let's look at this. So the conclusion is, in Sweden, there is a second wave. But in Sweden, which had high death numbers up front, a lot of virus was out there, for some reason, the death rate is still real low. This is the average here for this last week has been less than 2 or 3. And there were many days in which, in the first wave, it was over 100. So the death rate's about 1/20th, 1/40th, a small fraction of what it was before. So what can you say here? If what I'm saying is true, let's look and see if that rationale and argument applies to other places. Let's see. Let's go to New York, okay? Remember how bad New York was eat up with, okay? Let's go to good old New York. Now, let's look at New York has got some new cases, doesn't it? It's kind of like a second wave, maybe 1,500. Let's click on it. Let's see what that graph looks like. Remember how bad New York had it? Shut down everything eventually. Okay, yeah. Okay. See, the total cases kind of flatlined out. Now at the end, it's starting to curve up a little bit. Look at these cases in New York. Huge spike, over 10,000 a day at one point, just in New York. It was ripping through their nursing homes. And the average day, truth be told, average age was probably 80 years old. Okay, so yeah, it was ripping through the nursing homes. Tremendous number of deaths. Look at the new cases. There is a little bit of a spike over here. See how it's coming up a little bit? I'll give you a daily comparison. Look, August 30th, 780 cases, and then we come down to, let's just go in here. We got 2,000 on October 21st. So in the last 60 days, this kind of rate has doubled a little bit. But let's look at their death rate. We've seen that they're having a little bit of a second wave in New York. Let's look at their death rate. We see the active cases, but now, and now let's look at death rate. Look how flat the total deaths is. That's flat. It's not coming up anymore. Now let's look at, look, it's trailing off. It's going off to nothing. Remember during the first wave, deaths in New York got almost like, hey, one day they went over 1,000. One day in New York, there was over 1,000 deaths reported. Now that certainly had to scare somebody. It scared the mayor, scared the, oh, that sounds scary. Because if that kept going for a whole year, that'd be 1,000 a day for 365 days a year would be 365,000 deaths. That is very scary. Woo! But what is happening to it right now according to this graph? Look at that. We're looking at 10, 15, it's in the teens. Even though we're in the second wave. So from the peak of 1,000, we're now 14 deaths a day. Now, I saw some people who were of the Jewish faith, and they were asked not to assemble in their home. And I know that fear wants to protect people. But if there's only 14 deaths in New York City, at any rate, I don't need to impose my values on this. This needs to be about science, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. But clearly, there is no second wave of deaths. In fact, the number of deaths is really trailed down. And in fact, down in August, look at that. The deaths just dropped out. Now, what's the average age of a lot of these deaths? Probably around 80 years old. But is there going to be a lot more COVID going on in New York? Yep. It's going to be, most of the people that didn't contact it before, a lot of them are going to contact it now. All right, now let's go to, we've seen that there's no second wave increase in deaths. Now let's go to another state that was real bad. Let's go to, how about Jersey? New Jersey. See how the total cases is starting to go up a little bit on that graph? It's curving up. But let's see the first wave. See how big the first wave? It really looks like it's having a little bit more of a second wave in New Jersey than it's having the second wave is in New York. See how that wave's coming up a little bit? But let's look at our death rate. That's on the second wave in new cases. Let's look at deaths. This is when the peak happened. There was over 400 deaths a day in New Jersey that were reported to the health department. That's a lot. Now, a lot of those were elderly people. Some of them had cancer. Some of them were obese. Look at these rates out here. Is the death rate real high? Nope. Actually, we're looking at 16, 17, in the teens. So there is no second peak of deaths compared to the first peak. Much, 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 much smaller. And that is because much of the population is getting immune. That's wonderful news. So, remember the good news, the bad news. The good news is the actual death rates are down and are much lower than they were at the peak in New Jersey. The bad news is that there are more cases of COVID. That's bad. The good news is that those people that do get it are going to likely be immune, at least for some period of time, to reinfection. And not only that, I would say that any experience with that virus will probably provide you with some degree of better immunity as long as you get through it. Now, unfortunately, the coronavirus cannot just make people die. It's not just associated with death, but it's also associated with fatigue, some real other symptoms that are really unpleasant. So in today's message, and we're going to wrap this thing up, is that yes, there is a second wave, and there are hot spots that were not exposed before that are being exposed now. But the good news and the good message is the overall death rate compared to the case rate is down, and the number of deaths per day. Let's look at the whole U.S. Let's look at the whole U.S. Let's look at these U.S. totals. New cases, that's now, let me click in yesterday. 79,000. If we look, the new cases are going to be in the U.S. very high. However, the good news is the death rate's going down. Now, to give credit where credit's due, some of the effectiveness may be due to using Decadron in very severe cases, but in general, the CDC hasn't said there is a wonder drug. So in one hospital study, I think it dropped from the number of hospitalized people with COVID that were dying was as high as 25% at one time, and now it's just like 7-something%. It's dropped like 65% at least. That's amazing. A little bit of that is probably due to better treatments. A little bit of that is due to the fact that the real vulnerable have already been exposed, and now the people that are exposed are not so vulnerable. But what made those people less vulnerable? I think there's much, much more asymptomatic COVID than is candidly admitted. And I think our fear that there's going to go back to having 1,000 deaths a day is not going to be the case. In fact, I think that total number of deaths, look at there. Death rate is just 439, even though there is 59,000 deaths so far today. So you're not going to see, look, there were 784. even though there were 79,000 new cases. So you're seeing only this actually, I think went up to almost 3,000 a day at one point. So even though, and when it was 3,000 a day, the number of daily cases was much lower, like I think it was 50 or 60,000. So our relative death rate is down probably at least 75, 85%, somewhere in there. Now, I think Donald Trump would like you to believe that big pharmacy companies came out with wonder drugs and making all this possible, but I think probably many of the most vulnerable have already been exposed. I think these other people that are less vulnerable because of their age and other risk factors, but I think it's also probably true that at least partial COVID immunity is occurring due to accidental GI exposure. So I appreciate your attention today, and just remember that things are not as bleak as they might seem. And thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.